Welcome to today's energy expert interview, and we're going to be talking to economist Michael Berstein, who is the executive director of Canadians for Clean Prosperity. So welcome to the interview, Michael.
Good to be here.
Now, you're an expert on carbon pricing, and you sent around, I got your email, and talked about border carbon adjustments, and I get asked all the time, why should Canadian oil and gas producers pay a carbon tax? And the imported oil, which is between 600 and 700,000 barrels a day, so it's not a small amount, but they pay no carbon tax. And so it would seem that Canadian companies are unfairly taxed on this. What's your take on that?
I'd much prefer to see a border carbon tax. I think that would be a better policy for a number of reasons. I think, yes, it would satisfy the oil and gas sector's request to be able to compete on a more level playing field internationally. I think actually, though, the biggest benefit of a border carbon tax is that it provides a penalty for, and therefore an incentive for energy products and really all products coming into the country that are carbon intensive. So it allows us to extend our climate change policy beyond our borders and encourage other countries to adopt some sort of pricing program for their own producers.
How would that work exactly?
So there's a number of ways that you could structure this. The cleanest way to do it really is to say that any country that does not have a carbon price equivalent to the carbon price that we have domestically here in Canada is going to face a tariff on all their goods. Just put on a very simple 2, 3, 4% tariff on all goods from any country that doesn't seem to have an equivalent system. That's the cleanest form, but there's a whole variety of other ways you could do this. You could start to get very complicated, as Europe had tried to do in the past, by actually trying to understand the carbon content of different imports and try to levy a fee that corresponds to the amount of carbon they think is within the goods coming into the country. So that's kind of the two ends of the spectrum, and you can imagine various versions in between that.
Are there any discussions going on within Canada at the federal government level about bringing in a carbon border adjustment tax?
I think there are. I wouldn't say there are discussions about it being implemented in the near term, say the next 2 to 3 years. I can't really imagine that. I think, though, over the long term, there is a recognition, not just in Canada, but actually in the US and in Europe, that this is likely to be the key way in which we rally the world community to the cause of reducing our emissions to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. I mean, if you think about this, I mean, one approach that we've been trying for decades now is to try to get 190 plus countries to all come together to commit to targets and then try to hold each other accountable. Well, think about the complexity of that versus a couple of the major economies, perhaps the G8 economies to start with, saying, look, we're just going to put a tariff on any countries who don't come along with a carbon pricing regime or that can show an equivalency to that. I mean, pretty quickly, I think you'd have most of the world, including China, coming along with that policy.
That's all the questions I've got, Michael. It's very insightful. And if you had your way, what would you recommend to the Canadian government in terms of a design for a border carbon adjustment tax?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say just before that, I do think, of course, the one thing that we haven't fully gotten into is there are trade implications of a border carbon tax. So I think if I was advising the Canadian government, I would have to acknowledge, and I think everyone would, the importance of U.S. policy as it relates to a border carbon tax, because the reality of our economy is that we're dependent on our trading relationship with the U.S. So in an ideal world, I would like to see the U.S. The U.S. and Canada coordinate on a border carbon tax. But what I would say is that the most impactful way for Canada to punch above its weight in the global effort to reduce climate change is through a border carbon tax. I think typically with government programs, you want to keep them as simple as possible to avoid lobbying efforts to get exemptions, to avoid getting mired in long court procedures later on. So I would say, similar to the recommendation that the Nobel Prize winning economist Bill Nordhaus made, in fact, he had a really valuable paper about this in Foreign Affairs fairly recently, that let's put on a very simple tariff on all the imports coming in from countries who don't have an equivalent pricing mechanism. You're already seeing the EU start to talk about doing this. Joe Biden in his campaign has pledged to do this. All the Democratic candidates, in fact, did, and Joe Biden continues to have that on his platform. So if we can get the U.S. to come along with us, I think this is it's probably the most impactful way we can influence the need to reduce global emissions.
Michael, thank you very much for this, and we look forward to chatting with you in the future.
My pleasure.